Welcome to this explainer. Have you ever caught yourself wondering how we as humans mentally survive the absolute chaos of watching history unfold right in front of us? Well, today we are going to bridge two worlds that honestly might seem light years apart at first glance. On one hand, we've got the highly contemplative, sometimes super abstract world of 19th and early 20th century poetic theory. And on the other, the gritty, visceral, and often bloody reality of anti-imperialist uprisings, specifically those massive 19th century upheavals. Sounds like a huge leap, right? But, as you'll see, the way we process the beauty of a poem is surprisingly tied to how we process the total chaos of a revolution. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive into this with a pretty brilliant thought from the poet T.S. Eliot. He argues that the impersonality of art consists in having found, while remaining right at the heart of human problems, a point of rest from which to estimate them. This idea of artistic impersonality, it actually provides a perfect philosophical anchor for our journey today. Now, Eliot isn't saying art is just emotionless, not at all. He's actually suggesting that art gives us a much-needed distance, a point of rest. Without that resting point, the sheer weight of human history with all its tragedy and conflict would just be completely overwhelming. Art literally allows us to stand right in the eye of the hurricane, fully aware of the swirling storm of human problems all around us, but giving us the clarity to actually stop, understand, and estimate them. To make sense of all this, here is our roadmap for the explainer. We're going to logically progress through theories of aesthetic knowledge, move into the revolutionary shock, look at Nehru on freedom's spirit, then the 1857 Indian Mutiny, and finally wrap up with art, illusion, and reality. So, starting off with Section 1, Theories of Aesthetic Knowledge, Understanding the Foundations of Thought. We really have to understand how we process the world before we can figure out how we revolt against it. The source material draws heavily on the philosopher Benedetto Croce for this. He splits knowledge into two totally distinct camps, intuitive knowledge and logical knowledge. Now, logical knowledge is the stuff of science and math, right? It's obtained through the intellect and deals with those big, universal truths. But intuitive knowledge, that's an entirely different ballgame. It's obtained through the imagination. It deals with the individual, the specific, the sensory stuff. Poetry and art, they live entirely in this intuitive realm. They act as this captivating energy, processing the world not through cold, hard logic, but through vivid, imaginative perception. And this brilliant intuitive energy holds profound historical power. The source uses a really beautiful illustration here. It describes how the poetry of Dante acts as a bridge thrown over the stream of time, actually uniting the ancient world with the modern world. Think about that for a second. Cold, logical facts might tell us the exact year Rome fell, sure, but it's the intuitive knowledge of art that truly connects distant human experiences. Art bridges distinct eras, proving that while massive empires rise and fall, our core human emotional experience, it stays deeply, deeply connected across the centuries. Moving into Section 2, the revolutionary shock, when history disrupts contemplation. Time to step out of that serene blue sky of aesthetic theory and head straight into the storms and deluges of historical action. The source material presents this incredibly stark assertion stating the decisive shock to thought comes with the French Revolution. Prior to this, you basically had centuries of somewhat stable, ordered contemplation in Europe, but this specific historical moment, it absolutely shattered that. It wasn't just a political change, it awakened a completely new artistic and human vocation. The sheer scale, the violence of the revolution, it forced thinkers and poets to realize, hey, we can't just sit in a place of wonder anymore and sing like birds of another world. They had to confront the gritty, frankly terrifying reality of human uprising. Let's move to and see how this builds, because this wasn't an isolated event. It triggered a massive, global ideological chain reaction. The source documents trace this incredible progression of revolt. First, we have the American Revolution, which the text notes corresponds with a shift in public opinion and free sentiments over in Europe. That initial spark directly led to the second great shock, the French Revolution, which completely disrupted the old despotic order. And finally, these swelling currents of opposition to tyranny carried right forward into the 1857 Indian Mutiny, framing it as a huge anti-imperialist struggle. One historical shockwave literally triggers the next, fundamentally altering how humanity views freedom and authority. And the poets of the era deeply internalized this entire sequence of shocks. The text points to Percy Bysshe Shelley as a really prime example of this shift.
In Shelley's work, we see aesthetic beauty blending directly into revolutionary action. Goodness is placed right next to sensuous beauty, but it doesn't stop there. It passes easily into a passion for freedom. The aesthetic appreciation of the world literally transforms into an instinct for self-sacrifice and rebellion against oppressors. Art becomes the emotional fuel for historical change.
Okay, Section 3. Nehru on Freedom's Spirit, the visceral reality of upheaval. We're moving directly into the Indian struggle for independence now.
Looking through the eyes of Jawaharlal Nehru, whose autobiography is actually heavily cited in our source document, we get a fascinating, almost detached view of historical change. He contrasts evolution and revolution. Evolution is defined as slow, steady, ordered progress. Revolution, on the other hand, is described as storms, deluges, sudden and terrifying. But what's absolutely crucial here is Nehru's neutral but very stark observation. He argues that both are equally necessary for humanity's growth. He writes that death and revolution are eternal verities, just exactly like life and evolution. So, just as nature sends sudden storms to level mountains, history occasionally requires the explosive, destructive fury of revolution to break stagnant systems.
So, the crucial point is how these grand historical storms actually feel on a human level. Reflecting on a moment of deep political despair and really the emptiness of dashed independence hopes, Nehru actually reaches for poetry. He hauntingly cites T.S. Eliot. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. I mean, this brilliantly illustrates the entire theme of our explainer today. Nehru, a man right in the trenches of a massive political struggle, weaves high poetic aesthetics perfectly into the tragic, exhausting reality of real-world history. Building on that, Nehru makes some pretty profound observations about modern humanity. With our ancient, mysterious connection to nature mostly lost, he argues we now have to seek meaning in the glory and the tragedy of humanity itself. We can't just turn a blind eye to the cruel eruptions of human desires that cause massive convulsions like the French and Russian revolutions. We really have to strive to understand them. And despite all the misery and inner tempests of intense political conflict, he maintains that we've got to keep faith in a great destiny. Understanding history's darkest moments becomes absolutely essential for our modern progress. Which brings us to Section 4, the 1857 Indian Mutiny, Historiographical Perspectives. We are stepping into the crucible of 1857 as strict, impartial reporters of the various frameworks cited in the source's massive bibliography. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the sheer diversity of frameworks presented side by side. On one hand, you have standard historical accounts by R.C. Majumdar and S.N. Sen, who meticulously document the mechanics of the Sepoy Mutiny and the civil rebellions. But right alongside them, the source heavily cites Marxist interpretations. Marx and Engels view 1857 specifically as the first Indian War of independence against imperialism. Lenin's collected works are cited to frame it broadly as the inevitable war of the oppressed against oppressors. Now, we aren't endorsing any specific viewpoint here, but rather showing how the source utilizes both traditional historical analysis and really sharp ideological lenses to decode the exact nature of this revolt. Synthesizing all of these vastly different perspectives, the text zeroes right in on the raw mechanics of popular disturbance. It neutrally presents this specific argument that the ultimate right of insurrection in these historical contexts is derived directly from a state using armed force to counteract the will of the nation. The text argues that when the standing army or imperial power enforces a will completely contrary to the populace, that resulting friction inevitably erupts into the last resort of popular armed resistance. All right, moving to our final part, Section 5, Art, Illusion, and Reality, Synthesizing Thought and Action. Let's bring this explainer full circle. To truly survive the horrors of history and appreciate the beauty of art, the text shows how the human mind uses a tool called aesthetic distance. It's essentially the ability of the percipient, the viewer or the citizen, to distance themselves from a thing as a direct physical object. By doing this, you actually gain a special sort of intimacy with the idea of it without being completely destroyed by its direct reality. It's kind of like how you can watch a devastating news report on a screen without fleeing your living room in absolute terror, you know? Humans process the paralyzing, devastating realities of revolution and oppression by framing them, understanding their meaning, and ultimately overcoming their direct power. And this mental framing, that is precisely where the revolution actually begins. Listen to this incredibly powerful quote from the source material regarding the struggle. Quote, "Every one of you should from this very moment consider yourself a free man or woman.
The chains of a slave are broken the moment he considers himself a free man. Wow, that is the ultimate synthesis of intuitive thought and physical reality. Long before the physical chains of imperialism are broken on an actual battlefield, the psychological chains literally must be broken in the mind through imagination and belief.
Which leaves us with a really profound thought to ponder as we wrap up. If we accept that the chains of reality, whether they be tyranny, empire, or oppression, are always first broken in the mind through intuitive thought and imagination, is poetry simply the aesthetic blueprint for human revolution? Does the artist merely draft the vision of freedom that the revolutionary ultimately bleeds to build? It's a massive, fascinating question about the power of ideas. I hope this explainer has left you eager to explore the incredible intersection of art, ideology, and history for yourselves. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll catch you next time.